The early morning of December 17, 1944, in the frozen forests of Belgium, revealed one of the starkest symbols of Germany's crumbling war machine. At precisely 5:30 a.m., in the small town of Honsfeld, the lead Tiger tank of SS Obersturm, Bandführer Joachim Peiper's column coughed, sputtered, and then went silent. The 700 horsepower Maybach engine that had carried this massive steel beast through previous battles refused to restart. When Peiper's driver checked the gauge, his worst fear was confirmed. The fuel tanks were dry. This was not an isolated inconvenience, but a disaster in the making. All around Peiper stretched one of the most formidable armored spearheads Germany had ever assembled. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 of the Waffen-SS most elite troops. Yet in that cold Belgian dawn, they were immobilized not by enemy fire, but by the simple absence of gasoline. Ahead lay Honsfeld, a key American supply point hastily abandoned by U.S. troops in the chaos of the opening German offensive. Fires still smoldered in oil drums, coffee remained hot in tin cups, and scattered equipment testified to how quickly the defenders had withdrawn. But what caught Peiper's eye was not the abandoned rifles or helmets. Lined neatly in rows were thousands of jerry cans, their olive drab paint unmistakably American. To German soldiers starved for fuel, this sight seemed like a miracle sent by the gods of war. As Peiper's adjutant pried one open and sniffed the contents, he confirmed what they desperately hoped. High-octane gasoline, better quality than anything Germany's own failing refineries could provide. The arithmetic was staggering. The depot contained 50,000 gallons of fuel, more than enough to keep Peiper's entire camp moving toward the Meuse River, the decisive objective of Hitler's Ardennes gamble. German officers and soldiers alike erupted into frenzied activity, refueling their tanks and trucks with relief. For a fleeting moment it felt as though fortune had smiled upon them. Yet for Peiper, as he walked among the piles of cans, a darker realization crept in. If the Americans could afford to abandon such an enormous quantity of fuel at a forward supply post, fuel that German divisions would guard with their lives, then Germany was already defeated. The Americans weren't just fighting with strength. They were fighting with such abundance that even waste or loss on this scale barely dented their war effort. To understand the weight of Peiper's realization, one must step back 6 months earlier. In June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had placed a grim report on the Führer's desk. Allied bombers had systematically devastated Germany's synthetic fuel plants, the backbone of its war economy. Once, proud facilities at Luna and Politz, which had produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April, were reduced to a trickle of just 5,000 tons by September. Hydrogenation plants at Blechhammer and Brux limped along at less than 10% of their intended output. By contrast, American oil wells were gushing. In 1944 alone, the United States produced 8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, even when counting captured Romanian fields and synthetic output, barely scraped together 33 million barrels. That meant the entire Reich produced less than 2% of America's petroleum. This disparity transformed modern war. German panzers and Luftwaffe fighters depended on petroleum, yet the Reich increasingly relied on horse-drawn wagons and desperate improvisation to move supplies. Even Hitler's grand offensive in the Ardennes carried the seeds of its own failure in fuel mathematics. German planners estimated the drive to Antwerp would require 5 million gallons. Hitler allocated 5 million. but transportation bottlenecks meant only half reached the front. From the outset, the success of the entire offensive depended on capturing Allied fuel depots, an admission that Germany was fighting on borrowed energy. In Peiper's case, his Kampfgruppe received just 31,000 gallons, enough for barely 50 miles of combat. The Meuse River lay 65 miles away. The math was merciless. Unless his troops seized American stockpiles, their mighty tanks would grind to a halt long before reaching their target. Thus, when he found the 50,000-gallon depot at Honsfeld, it seemed both salvation and condemnation. The Americans had left behind in one small village more fuel than Peiper's entire regiment had been allocated for its offensive thrust. As his men worked feverishly to fill their tanks, other discoveries deepened the sense of disparity. Shipping manifests revealed that this gasoline had traveled over 6,000 miles, from Texas oil fields to New York ports, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, ferried across the Channel to Normandy, and then trucked 400 miles inland to Belgium, all in less than 6 weeks. To Peiper and his men, this logistical miracle was almost incomprehensible. What Germany could barely transport across a few hundred kilometers, America moved effortlessly across ocean. In that cold dawn, as American gasoline poured into German steel monsters, Peiper saw both the fleeting possibility of advance and the inevitable doom of his nation. He understood that Germany was not simply outnumbered in men or outgunned in weapons. It was outproduced, out-supplied, and out-fueled on a scale that rendered battlefield bravery irrelevant. The war, he realized, was already lost. The discovery at Honsfeld was not just a battlefield episode, but a window into the much deeper crisis consuming the German war effort. By the end of 1944, fuel was the single most decisive resource Germany lacked, and every soldier, from the foot infantryman trudging through the Ardennes snow to the highest commanders in Berlin, felt the weight of that absence. Without oil, Germany could no longer wage mechanized war. The crisis had been building for years, but 1944 brought its breaking point. For most of the conflict, Germany's war machine relied heavily on synthetic fuel, produced by chemically converting coal into usable gasoline through the hydrogenation process. Plants at Luna, Politz, Blechhammer, and Brucks became lifelines, churning out hundreds of thousands of tons of aviation fuel, diesel, and motor gasoline each year. This fragile system, however, depended on complex machinery and massive facilities, perfect targets for Allied bombers. When the U.S. 8th Air Force and the RAF Bomber Command shifted their strategic focus to oil in the spring of 1944, the effects were immediate and catastrophic. In May, Speer still promised Hitler that output would rebound after repairs, but by September reality was undeniable. Where Germany had produced over 175,000 tons of fuel in April, output plummeted to a paltry 5,000 tons by late summer. The once proud Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe in 1940, was reduced to shadows of its former self. Fighter pilots received only enough fuel for a handful of training flights before being thrown into combat. Bomber crews, once capable of devastating cities like Rotterdam and Warsaw, now sat grounded on runways, their aircraft empty shells without fuel. Some Luftwaffe aces, bitter and defeated, recalled later that they had more kills to their name than hours remaining in their flight logs. The consequences rippled through every level of German warfare. Panzer divisions, meant to be the cutting edge of blitzkrieg, often had to rely on horse-drawn supply wagons, Tanks were hidden in forests for weeks at a time, waiting for just enough gasoline to move them into ambush positions. Infantry commanders reported situations where entire regiments advanced on foot, while their armored support remained motionless for lack of fuel. Even elite SS divisions, like Peiper's, found themselves rationed to a fraction of what their operations required. By contrast, the Allies enjoyed a staggering abundance. American oil fields in Texas, Oklahoma, and California gushed millions of barrels per month. Tankers carried it across the Atlantic, protected by ever stronger Allied navies. In Britain, ports like Liverpool and Bristol became fuel gateways, from which thousands of trucks and rail cars carried gasoline to the front lines. The difference was so extreme that American commanders often complained about managing the oversupply, something their German adversaries could scarcely imagine. In fact, U.S. depots sometimes burned or discarded fuel rather than risk overstocking vulnerable positions. To Germany, fighting tooth and nail for every gallon, this looked like reckless extravagance. To America, it was simply the reality of industrial war. It was in this context that Hitler conceived the Ardennes offensive. His generals knew the numbers didn't add up. To launch nearly 200,000 troops and thousands of vehicles into the frozen forests of Belgium would require more fuel than Germany possessed. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, no stranger to bold plans, admitted bluntly, "It is not the enemy that will defeat us, it is fuel." But Hitler, stubborn and obsessed with reversing his fortunes, demanded the gamble. He believed a lightning strike through the Ardennes could split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. To make that possible, German troops would have to seize American depots along the way. The offensive, therefore, was not only a military strike, but a logistical heist, an attempt to steal the lifeblood of mechanized war directly from their enemies. Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe embodied this paradox. On paper, it was a fearsome armored spearhead, bristling with tigers, panthers, and half-tracks. In practice, it was a desperate gamble. His column carried enough fuel for just 50 miles of advance. Every additional mile depended on capturing Allied supplies, and if they failed, their offensive would wither where it stood. That is why the 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld carried such symbolic weight. It was a fleeting glimpse of what Germany needed but could no longer provide for itself. As December wore on, the consequences became clear. Peiper's column, after smashing through American defenses, stalled again and again for lack of gasoline. Tanks were abandoned, blown up by their own crews when they could no longer move. Trucks carrying desperately needed fuel were ambushed or destroyed by American fighter bombers. The very resource that had allowed Blitzkrieg to roll across Europe in 1940 now became the chain that shackled Germany in 1944. The Ardennes offensive, bold in conception, collapsed in execution, not because of lack of courage or tactical skill, but because of empty fuel tanks. After refueling at Honsfeld, Peiper pushed his Kampfgruppe westward, determined to exploit the brief advantage the captured gasoline had given him. For a time, the offensive moved with frightening speed. His column of panthers, tigers, and half-tracks cut through thin American defenses, overrunning small villages and scattering inexperienced units caught off guard by the sudden German thrust. To the men of the Waffen-SS, it felt like a fleeting return to the glory days of Blitzkrieg, when armored columns had raced across France in 1940. But beneath this surface momentum lay the same unrelenting reality. Every mile they advanced drained fuel faster than they could replace it. On December 17, Peiper's troops clashed with elements of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion near the crossroads village of Bognes. The Americans, lightly armed and unprepared for armored assault, quickly surrendered. What followed became one of the darkest episodes of the entire Ardennes offensive, the Malmedy massacre. Over 80 American prisoners were herded into a snowy field, where they were gunned down by SS troops. Some were executed on the spot, others were hunted down as they tried to flee. Though Peiper later denied ordering the killings, the massacre would forever stain the reputation of his unit and inflame American resolve to fight. Survivors spread word quickly, and soon the name Peiper became synonymous with brutality. For the German soldiers who carried it out, the massacre brought no strategic advantage, only a grim reminder that desperation was driving them to savagery. Despite such brutal methods, fuel remained the true enemy. Every engagement cost Peiper not only ammunition and lives, but also precious gallons of gasoline. His column, stretching for miles, guzzled fuel at a staggering rate. Heavy Tiger tanks burned up to 5 gallons per mile, and Panthers were little better. Supply trucks laden with fuel were targeted relentlessly by American fighter bombers, whose dominance of the skies grew worse with each passing day. On December 18, a Luftwaffe officer attached to Peiper admitted bitterly, "We are lions with empty stomachs. Our claws are sharp, but we cannot move." Peiper's men began improvising. Abandoned American vehicles were stripped for every drop of gasoline. Mechanics drained fuel lines from captured jeeps, siphoned from knocked-out Shermans, and even tapped civilian fuel stores in farmhouses along the road. Yet the numbers never worked. Each gallon captured bought only minutes of advance, while the distance to the Meuse, the critical river crossing, remained dozens of miles away. What had seemed possible on Hitler's map became impossible on the frozen roads of Belgium. The worsening situation began to sap morale. Soldiers who had once laughed at the Americans' inexperience now realized they were trapped in a war of attrition they could not win. One SS sergeant later recalled, "We looked at the American depots, the food, the fuel, the endless columns of trucks. We thought, if they can leave this behind and still fight, then what chance do we have? Our whole Reich was starving, and they threw away more than we could ever dream of having." The contrast between German scarcity and American abundance became undeniable with every captured can of gasoline. As Peiper pressed toward Stavelot, the struggle for fuel grew even more desperate. American engineers had blown bridges and dams, flooding roads to slow the German advance. Each detour meant more wasted fuel, each delay another chance for Allied aircraft to strike. On December 19, Peiper seized Stavelot itself, but at terrible cost. The Americans had flooded the Ambel River, cutting off routes for resupply. Worse, a massive fuel dump just outside the town was set ablaze by retreating American forces, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. Peiper's men, who had hoped to seize hundreds of thousands of gallons, watched helplessly as their salvation went up in flames. For many, this was the moment they knew the offensive was doomed. The fighting grew increasingly savage. Cut off from supplies, Peiper's men lashed out with fury, burning villages and executing civilians suspected of aiding the Allies. Yet these acts only hardened American resistance. Everywhere his tanks rolled, resistance stiffened, and fuel supplies dwindled further. The brief euphoria of Honsfeld faded into grim resignation. By December 20, Peiper's mighty spearhead had been reduced to a lumbering, fuel-starved column, encircled by Allied forces and harried from the air. The massacre at Malmedy, the burning of Stavelot's fuel, and the endless ambushes along the narrow Belgian roads combined to reveal the true nature of the Ardennes offensive. It was not a revival of Blitzkrieg, but its funeral procession. For Peiper's men, every captured gallon of fuel was a reprieve, not a victory. The realization grew clear: no matter how fiercely they fought, their engines would eventually go silent, leaving them stranded in hostile territory. By December 21, 1944, the promise of Peiper's advance had evaporated. What began as Hitler's most ambitious gamble since 1940, the thrust through the Ardennes toward Antwerp, was reduced to a desperate struggle for survival. Kampfgruppe Peiper, which had roared into Belgium with 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, and nearly 5,000 men, now found itself encircled, starved of supplies, and stranded deep behind enemy lines. The decisive factor was not Allied firepower alone, but the slow strangulation of fuel. The very lifeblood of mechanized warfare had bled away, mile by mile, until even Germany's most fearsome armored division became immobile. The terrain itself seemed to conspire against them. The Ardennes, with its narrow forested roads, forced Peiper's column into long, vulnerable lines. Each bridge destroyed by retreating Americans slowed them further. Each detour consumed gallons of fuel they could not spare. Allied fighter bombers, swooping down from clear winter skies, turned every daylight movement into a gauntlet of fire. The German dream of swift armored penetration had dissolved into a slow crawl, punctuated by ambushes and fuel shortages. Peiper, who had once envisioned breaking through to the Meuse River in days, now fought simply to keep his column moving a few miles at a time. The fuel crisis reached its breaking point at La Glise, a small village where Peiper halted on December 23. By then, his tanks were running on fumes. Mechanics siphoned gasoline from wrecked vehicles, shared fuel between tanks, and even considered towing Panthers with captured American trucks. But the numbers could not be made to work. The Meuse lay far beyond reach, and every attempt to move west drained what little remained. Soon, entire companies of vehicles were immobilized, sitting targets for Allied artillery and air strikes. German crews watched helplessly as their proud war machines stood silent in the snow, reduced to steel coffins without the fuel to move. Peiper's men fortified La Glise, turning it into a strongpoint while they waited for relief that never came. American forces encircled the village, cutting off all supply routes. What little food and fuel remained dwindled rapidly. Ammunition was rationed, vehicles cannibalized, and morale deteriorated. The once proud Waffen-SS soldiers, who had struck fear into their enemies with their armored thrust, now faced the humiliating prospect of abandoning their heavy equipment. For German tankers, trained to treat their machines as extensions of themselves, the order to destroy their own Panthers and Tigers was a bitter pill. One officer later recalled, "We had polished them, fought with them, trusted them. To set them ablaze with our own hands was like burning our brothers." On the night of December 24, under cover of darkness, Peiper gave the order to withdraw. His once mighty Kampfgruppe now consisted of weary men on foot, slipping through forests and snowdrifts, carrying only small arms and what supplies they could salvage. Behind them, explosions rocked La Glise as German troops set charges in their tanks and half-tracks, ensuring nothing could be captured by the Americans. In total, more than 100 armored vehicles, including nearly all of Peiper's remaining Panthers and several King Tigers, were left behind, silent monuments to the futility of the Ardennes offensive. The retreat was harrowing. American patrols hunted them through the woods, while local Belgian civilians, embittered by massacres and scorched-earth tactics, guided Allied troops to intercept the retreating Germans. Dozens were killed or captured in ambushes. Peiper himself barely escaped, leading a ragged column of survivors back to German lines on Christmas Eve, Of the nearly 5,000 men who had begun the offensive, fewer than 800 returned in organized fashion. The rest were dead, captured, or scattered in the Ardennes forests. The collapse of Kampfgruppe Peiper was more than just a tactical defeat. It was a symbol of Germany's strategic bankruptcy. Hitler had launched his great winter gamble in the belief that surprise, daring, and armored thrusts could overcome material inferiority. Instead, the Ardennes revealed the inescapable truth. Modern war was decided as much by logistics as by courage. Germany's tanks were powerful, its soldiers battle hardened, but without fuel, all of it was useless. The abandoned hulks at La Gleize told the story more eloquently than any speech or report. Germany was no longer capable of sustaining mechanized warfare, and no amount of battlefield bravery could change that. For the Allies, the destruction of Peiper's column was a turning point. It demonstrated that even the best equipped and most determined German units could be defeated by superior logistics and air power. For the Germans, it was a bitter lesson written in smoke and steel. The age of blitzkrieg was over, and the Reich was running on empty. The retreat of Kampfgruppe Peiper marked more than the failure of one unit. It foreshadowed the unraveling of the Third Reich itself. By the beginning of 1945, the illusion of German resurgence had been shattered. The Ardennes offensive, conceived as a bold strike to split the Allied armies and force negotiations, ended in catastrophe. Instead of pushing the Americans into retreat, the offensive drained Germany's last reserves of manpower, tanks, and above all, fuel. For Hitler, it had been a desperate gamble. For his soldiers, it became a death march. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In the 6 weeks of fighting, Germany lost over 600 tanks and assault guns, thousands of vehicles, and more than 100 men killed, wounded, or captured. The Allies suffered heavily too, some 80,000 casualties. But unlike the Germans, they had the reserves to replace their losses almost immediately. American factories rolled out new Shermans and trucks by the hundreds each week, while the Luftwaffe's once proud fighter wings dwindled into irrelevance. Fuel depots in Belgium and France were replenished with astonishing speed, their pipelines stretching back to ports fed by the limitless wells of Texas and Oklahoma. Germany, by contrast, had no such reserves. Each panther or tiger lost was irreplaceable. Each drop of fuel burned a step closer to exhaustion. By January 1945, the Western Allies were advancing again, pushing the Germans back through the very ground they had bled to seize. To the east, the Red Army launched its Vistula-Oder offensive, smashing through exhausted German defenses and reaching within 60 miles of Berlin by February. The Reich was collapsing from both directions, and the Ardennes gamble had only accelerated its destruction. The very fuel that Peiper had so desperately sought in Belgium was now flowing in an unstoppable tide toward Allied armies, powering tanks, trucks, and bombers that closed the noose around Germany. For Peiper and others who had witnessed the disparity firsthand, the lesson was unmistakable. Standing among the abandoned hulks of his prized tigers, he had realized that Germany was doomed not because its soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because the Reich could not match the industrial and logistical power of its enemies. In that sense, the 50,000 gallons of fuel captured at Honsfeld became more than a tactical windfall. It was a revelation. If the Americans could leave such abundance behind and still fight without pause, then the war was already decided. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. German soldiers spoke in hushed tones about the scale of Allied supply. They had seen depots overflowing with food, fuel, and ammunition, while back home their families starved and their units rationed every bullet. To them, the war had transformed into a contest between scarcity and abundance, and scarcity could not win. A German officer captured in January summed it up bleakly: "For every tank we have, they have 10. For every shell, they have 100. For every gallon, they have 1,000. We fight, but numbers and fuel will bury us." When the war finally ended in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Its cities were rubble, its armies shattered, and its fuel reserves virtually non-existent. What little synthetic production remained had been obliterated by bombing, and Romanian oil fields were long since lost to the Soviets. The once feared panzers now stood silent in fields and forests, monuments to a war machine that had run dry. By contrast, American convoys rolled through Europe in endless streams, delivering not just supplies for battle, but food, medicine, and rebuilding. The war had proven what Peiper realized on that cold December morning. In modern mechanized warfare, logistics were destiny. The irony was sharp. The Waffen-SS commander who once commanded some of Germany's most powerful tanks understood, in that moment at Honsfeld, the true measure of defeat. It was not the courage of Allied soldiers, though they fought bravely. It was not even the brilliance of Allied generals, though they planned effectively. It was the simple fact that the United States and its allies had resources so vast they could afford to abandon what Germany would kill to possess. The abandoned 50,000 gallons of gasoline were more than fuel. They were the symbol of industrial supremacy. In the end, the Ardennes offensive became not Germany's triumph, but its epitaph. What was meant to be a thunderclap across the Western Front became the final proof that the Reich was living on borrowed time. For Joachim Peiper and the men who staggered back from La Gleize, the lesson was inescapable. Germany's war machine was finished, not by the gun or the tank, but by the empty fuel tank. The war had run its course, and Germany, starved of the lifeblood of modern war, had been left to die on the frozen roads of Belgium.